The Arizona Territory, 1887. In the suffocating heat of a summer that had already claimed 12 lives in Copper Ridge alone, a woman stumbled through the sagebrush carrying 3 infants against her chest. Her dress, once fine silk, now hung. In tatters, blood matted her auburn hair, where something or someone had struck her head with brutal force. But it wasn't the crimson staining her temple that would haunt those who found her. It was her eyes, empty, vacant, as if someone had reached into her mind and stolen every memory, every name, every piece of who she had been. She knew nothing. Not her name, not where she came from, not even how she'd come to possess 3 newborn babies with identical crescent-shaped birthmarks behind their left ears. All she knew was that she would die before letting anyone harm them. What she didn't know was that those birthmarks would soon catch the attention of the most feared tracker. In the American West, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow across the desert. A man who never forgot a face, a mark, or a debt. And when Silas Kane recognized those distinctive crescents, everything she thought she understood about her situation would shatter like glass against stone. This is the story of a woman with no past, 3 children with a dangerous heritage, and the deadly pursuit that would force them all to discover what family truly means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah, though she didn't know that was her name, pressed the 3 infants closer to her chest. Her bare feet, cut and bleeding from the rocky terrain, left a trail of crimson droplets on the sun-baked earth. Each step sent waves of agony through her skull, where the head wound throbbed with a rhythm that matched her failing heartbeat. How long had she been walking? The question surfaced in her mind like a bubble rising through thick mud, only to burst. Without bringing any answers, time had no meaning in this wasteland of sage and stone. The sun could have been her companion for hours or days. Her shattered mind couldn't distinguish between the two. The babies stirred against her, their tiny fists clenching at the rough fabric of what remained of her dress. 3 perfect children, each no more than a few weeks old, their skin still bearing that translucent quality of the newly born. 2 boys and a girl, though she had no idea how she knew this so certainly. Their matching crescent birthmarks, dark as coffee grounds against their pale skin, seemed to pulse with significance she couldn't grasp. Why 3? Why her? And why couldn't she remember anything before waking up in that overturned stagecoach with these children crying in her arms? The wreckage had been brutal. Splintered wood, scattered belongings, and blood, so much blood, painting the desert floor in abstract patterns that made her stomach lurch. But no other bodies, no other survivors. Just her and 3 infants who shouldn't have survived such destruction, yet somehow had emerged without a scratch. Her legs buckled and she stumbled, catching herself against a weathered boulder that radiated heat like a furnace. The babies whimpered, sensing her distress through some primal connection that transcended words. She looked down at them, these tiny souls entrusted to her care, and felt something fierce and protective surge through her exhausted body. "I won't let anyone hurt you," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry as desert sand. "I don't know who I am, but I know that much." The promise felt sacred, binding her to these children with invisible chains stronger than iron. It was the first certainty she'd felt since opening her eyes in that demolished coach, and she clung to it like a lifeline. Movement on the horizon caught her attention, a dust cloud rising against the copper-colored sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the distant shapes of horsemen materialized through the heat shimmer. Help, perhaps, or something far worse. She'd heard stories, fragments of conversations that drifted through her damaged memory like smoke. The Arizona Territory was lawless land, where desperate men did unspeakable things to survive. where women traveling alone faced fates worse than death, where children, her arms tightened protectively around the infants. Whatever those riders represented, she couldn't afford to wait and discover their intentions. Not with 3 helpless lives depending on her. Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed away from the boulder and continued her desperate journey. Her destination remained unclear. Somewhere ahead lay civilization, surely. A town, a ranch, somewhere these children could find safety while she tried to piece together the fragments of her shattered existence. The sun climbed higher, transforming the desert into a furnace that sucked moisture from her body with ruthless efficiency. Her lips cracked and bled, her vision blurred at the edges, creating dancing mirages that taunted her with promises of water and shade. But still she walked, driven by an instinct stronger than self-preservation. Behind her, the dust cloud grew larger. The riders were gaining ground, their horses fresh, while she stumbled forward on failing legs. She could hear them now, the thunder of hooves, the jingle of spurs, voices calling out in a language that might have been Spanish or English. Her damaged mind couldn't process the words. Panic clawed at her throat. These men, whoever they were, meant danger. Every fiber of her being screamed warnings she couldn't understand, but dared not ignore. The children's birthmarks seemed to burn against her skin where they pressed close, as if those crescent shapes held significance that others would recognize and exploit. What if these men knew who she was? What if they were responsible for the stagecoach accident? What if they'd come to finish what they'd started? The questions multiplied like desert thorns, each one drawing blood from her already wounded psyche. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A fierce maternal instinct that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the 3 beating hearts pressed against her own. She spotted a cluster of rocks ahead, their surfaces carved by wind and time into shapes that might provide concealment. It wasn't much, but it was better than standing exposed in the open desert like a target painted against the sky. Her feet found new reserves of strength, carrying her toward the meager shelter with desperate determination. The sound of pursuit grew louder. Male voices, rough and urgent, called out words her mind refused to interpret. She didn't need to understand their language to recognize the tone. Predatory, hungry, dangerous. These weren't rescuers, they were hunters, and she was their prey. She reached the rocks just as her legs finally gave out, collapsing behind a boulder that barely concealed her huddled form. The babies sensed her terror and began to cry, soft, mewling sounds that might as well have been screams in the desert silence. She pressed them closer, trying to muffle their distress against her body while her mind raced through impossible calculations. How long before the riders reached this spot? How long could 3 infants survive without proper food and water? How long before her own failing body gave out entirely? The hoofbeats were close now, so close she could feel the vibration through the ground. Voices shouted back and forth, a search pattern she realized with growing dread. They were hunting systematically, checking every possible hiding place. Her, and moved instinctively to the largest baby, the boy whose eyes held an unsettling intelligence for one so young. His crescent birthmark seemed darker than the others, more pronounced, as if it had been branded rather than born naturally. When her finger traced its outline, he stopped crying and stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Who were these children? And why did she feel as if their lives and her own depended on keeping those birthmarks hidden from the world? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The riders passed within 30 yards of her hiding spot, their horses snorting and stamping in the heat. Through gaps in the rock formation, she caught glimpses of weathered faces beneath wide-brimmed hats, gun belts slung low on their hips, and the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence One of them, a lean man with silver hair and a scar bisecting his left cheek, seemed to be studying the ground with unusual intensity. "Trail goes cold here, Joaquin," he called, out in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of leadership. "The winds covered her tracks, but she can't have gone far, not carrying 3 babies in this heat. They knew about the children." The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a chance encounter or random pursuit. These men were specifically hunting her and the infants. But why? What made 3 newborns valuable enough to risk crossing the brutal Arizona desert? The man called Joaquin spat into the dust. "Patron won't be pleased if we return empty-handed. You know what happened to the last men who disappointed him. Then we don't return empty-handed," the scarred leader replied coldly. "Spread out. Check every rock, every shadow. She's here somewhere, and she's getting weaker by the hour." The search party dispersed, their horses picking careful paths through the scattered boulders. She pressed herself deeper into the crevice, the babies mercifully quiet against her chest. Every breath felt like fire in her lungs, every heartbeat a thunderclap that surely would give away their position. One rider approached her hiding spot, close enough that she could smell the leather and sweat of his horse. The animal snorted, sensing something amiss, and began to turn toward her concealment. Panic flooded her system as the horse's hooves crunched closer to the rock that shielded her from view. Then, like a miracle born of desperation, a gunshot cracked across the desert. "Riders coming in from the east," someone shouted. "Move out, now!" The search party regrouped with military precision. Their attention shifted from finding her to identifying this new threat. Through the chaos of men and horses, she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, different from her pursuers, more organized, purposeful. "Iron Cross Brand," one of the original riders called out, his voice tight with worry. "That's Clayton McKinnon's outfit." The scarred leader cursed in Spanish. "Fall back! We're not equipped for a fight with McKinnon's men, not today." As quickly as they had arrived, her pursuers vanished into the desert heat, leaving only dust and the acrid smell of fear in their wake. She remained frozen in her hiding spot, afraid to move, afraid to hope that salvation might actually be approaching. The new riders crested a low rise, and her heart nearly stopped. 6 men on horseback wearing matching leather vests with an iron cross burned into the chest. Real cowboys, not the desert scavengers who had been hunting her. Their leader, a man with sandy hair and kind eyes, raised his hand to halt the group. "Spread out, boys. Sam saw something moving through here earlier. Could be travelers in trouble." "This heat's been killing folks left and right, boss," called out a younger cowboy with a distinctive Texas drawl. "Found another body yesterday near Willow Creek. Desert don't forgive mistakes." The leader, McKinnon, she presumed, dismounted and began examining the ground with the same intensity as her earlier pursuers, but with entirely different intent. Where the others had hunted, he searched to help. "Fresh tracks here," he announced. "Someone on foot, carrying something heavy. Blood drops too." His voice carried concern rather than predatory excitement. "Hello? Anyone out there? We're from the Iron Cross Ranch. We're here to help." The sincerity in his voice broke through her paralysis. These men weren't hunters. They were rescuers. The babies stirred against her chest, sensing the change in her body language, and one of them let out a soft cry that echoed off the rocks. McKinnon's head snapped toward the sound. "Over here, behind the rocks!" She emerged from her hiding spot like a ghost materialized from stone, her legs barely supporting her weight. The cowboys' expressions shifted from alertness to shock as they took in her condition. The blood-matted hair, the torn dress, the 3 infants clutched protectively in her arms. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," breathed the young Texan. "Ma'am, what happened to you?" McKinnon approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, recognizing her fragile state. "You're safe now, miss. My name's Clayton McKinnon. This is my ranch crew. We're going to take care of you and those babies." She began, then stopped. What could she say? that she had no memory, that she'd awakened in a destroyed stagecoach with 3 children she couldn't identify, that men with guns had been hunting them across the desert. "I don't remember anything. There was an accident, I think. These children—" "Easy now," McKinnon said gently. "We'll sort everything out back at the ranch. Right now you need water, food and medical attention." He turned to his men. "Jimmy, give me your canteen. Pete, ride back and tell Doc Hennessy we've got injured folks coming in. Tom, bring my horse over here gentle-like." The cowboys moved with practiced efficiency, their actions speaking to a culture of helping those in need rather than exploiting their weakness. When McKinnon offered her the canteen, she drank greedily, the water tasting like liquid salvation. Against her parched throat, "The babies," she managed between sips. They need their mama healthy first," McKinnon interrupted kindly. "Doc's got experience with infants, lost his own wife in childbirth years back, dedicated his life to making sure other babies make it through." He studied her face with compassionate eyes. "Can you ride, or should we rig up a travois?" "I can ride," she said, though her legs felt like water and her head spun with exhaustion. Pride apparently survived even when memory didn't. McKinnon helped her mount his horse, a gentle gelding with patient eyes, while she maintained her protective grip on the 3 infants. The cowboys formed a protective circle around her as they began the journey to the Iron Cross Ranch, their presence a welcome buffer between her and the vast, dangerous emptiness of the desert. As they rode, McKinnon engaged her in gentle conversation, clearly trying to help her remember something, anything, about her identity and circumstances. "The stagecoach," she said slowly, fragments beginning to surface like debris after a storm. There was screaming, men with bandanas covering their faces. They were looking for something. She touched the largest baby's crescent birthmark unconsciously. "Or someone." McKinnon's expression darkened. "Bandits have been hitting coaches pretty regular lately, usually after payroll shipments or wealthy passengers." He paused. "You remember anything about the other passengers? Where the coach was headed?" Flashes of memory flickered through her damaged mind, like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. A woman in expensive clothes, screaming orders. A man with a beard clutching a leather satchel like his life depended on it. The sound of gunfire and splintering wood. And through it all, 3 babies crying with voices that seemed strangely familiar, as if she'd been listening to them long before the accident. "There were others," she whispered. "Important people, I think. The bandits kept asking about something. A name, maybe? I can't—" The memory slipped away like sand through her fingers. "Don't force it," McKinnon advised. "Doc says, sometimes, memories come back on their own time when the mind's ready to handle them." The Iron Cross Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage made real, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by corrals and pastures where cattle grazed in whatever shade they could find. It represented civilization, safety, and hope in a landscape that had offered only death and desperation. But as they approached the ranch gates, she couldn't shake the feeling that bringing these 3 children here might be putting everyone in danger. The birthmarks that marked them seemed to burn against her skin, and somewhere in her fractured memory, a voice whispered warnings she couldn't quite understand. What if those men came back? What if they brought more riders? What if the very act of seeking sanctuary had doomed the people trying to help her? The questions multiplied as the ranch house grew larger, but there was no turning back now. For better or worse, the Iron Cross Ranch would be their refuge while she tried to piece together the mystery of who she was and why 3 innocent babies had made her a target in the unforgiving American West. Dr. Edmund Hennessy was nothing like the frontier physicians she'd expected to find in the Arizona Territory. A distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and gentle hands, he moved through his examination with the precision of someone trained in the finest medical schools back east. His office, attached to the ranch's main house, contained more books than she'd seen outside of a proper library. "The head wound is healing well," he said, carefully probing the tender spot where her skull had been struck. "No signs of infection, though the blow was severe enough to cause your memory loss. These things can be temporary, or—" He paused tactfully. "Well, let's focus on getting you healthy first." She sat on the examination table wearing a borrowed dress from McKinnon's housekeeper, a motherly woman named Rosa, who had clucked over her condition like a hen with injured chicks. The 3 babies lay in a makeshift nursery that Rosa had assembled with remarkable speed, wooden crates lined with soft blankets, positioned where the lamplight would keep them warm without being too bright. "Doctor," she said hesitantly, "the children aren't mine." Hennessy's hands stilled on his instruments. "I beg your pardon. I know it sounds impossible, but I can feel it. The way a mother knows her own child's cry, their weight, their needs. These babies." She looked at the 3 sleeping infants. "I care for them deeply, would die protecting them, but they're not mine. Someone entrusted them to me, and I can't remember who or why." The doctor studied her face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading truth in his patient's eyes. "The birthmarks," he said finally. "May I examine them more closely?" She nodded, lifting the largest boy from his makeshift crib. As Hennessy's fingers traced the crescent-shaped mark behind the child's ear, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Have you seen marks like this before?" she asked, noting his reaction. "Once," he admitted reluctantly. "Years ago, when I was practicing in San Francisco, a wealthy family brought their newborn son to me, terrified because the child bore a similar mark. They claimed it was a curse, that certain families in Mexico were marked this way by—" He stopped abruptly. "Forgive me. Old superstitions have no place in medical practice." What did they believe it meant? Hennessy set down his instruments and moved to the window, staring out at the darkening desert. The family spoke of blood debts, of children marked for vengeance before they could even walk. They said there were men who could identify these marks across generations, who would hunt the children down to settle scores that began before their grandparents were born. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. What happened to the family in San Francisco? They disappeared one night, left everything behind, house, business, servants, and vanished as if they'd never existed. The authorities found no trace of violence, no sign of struggle. They simply, he gestured helplessly, gone. The implications settled over her like a suffocating blanket. If these children carried marks that made them targets, then everyone who helped them was in danger. McKinnon, Rosa, Dr. Hennessy, the entire Iron Cross Ranch, all of them potentially sacrificing their lives for 3 babies whose only crime was bearing distinctive birthmarks. "I have to leave," she said, moving toward the cribs. "Tonight. Before whoever's hunting them finds this place?" "Absolutely not." The doctor's voice carried surprising steel. "You're in no condition to travel, and those infants need proper care. Besides, where would you go? The desert will kill you all within a day. Better the desert than bringing death to innocent people." "Clara." The name struck her like a physical blow. She spun to face him, her hand flying to her throat. "What did you say?" "Clara," he repeated, studying her reaction carefully. "When you were unconscious earlier, you spoke in your sleep. You kept saying Clara must protect them, over and over." The name resonated through her damaged mind like a bell, awakening echoes of memory that remained frustratingly just beyond reach. Clara. Yes, that felt right. Felt like coming home after a long journey. But Clara what? Clara who? "There's more." Dr. Hennessy continued. "You also spoke about Sacramento, about a mansion with white columns and gardens full of roses. You said someone was coming, someone who never forgets a debt. Sacramento. The word triggered a cascade of fragmented images: a grand house overlooking the American River, a woman in silk screaming orders, men in expensive suits discussing business, while children played in elaborately landscaped gardens. And through it all, a sense of mounting danger, of time running out, of desperate plans made in whispered conferences behind locked doors. "The stagecoach," she whispered, pieces beginning to connect. "We were running from something, someone. These children—" She looked at the sleeping infants with new understanding. "They're not random victims, they're specifically targeted." A knock at the door interrupted her revelation. McKinnon entered, his expression grim. "Doc, we've got a problem. 3 of my men just rode in from the north pasture. They saw smoke on the horizon. Looks like the widow Thompson's place is burning." Dr. Hennessy paled. "Martha Thompson? She lives alone out there with just her grandson." "Rode out to check on her," McKinnon continued. "Found the house gutted, but no bodies. Neighbors say they saw riders heading toward her place just before sunset. Mexican saddles, they said, and one man with a scar across his face, asking questions about a woman traveling with babies." Clara, she was certain of it now, felt the blood drain from her cheeks. "They found me. This is my fault." "Nobody's blaming you for anything," McKinnon said firmly, "but we need to make some decisions. And fast. Those riders are working in a pattern, checking every ranch and homestead in a widening circle. They'll be here within 2 days, maybe less." "Then I leave tonight," Clara said, standing despite her weakness. "I won't let them hurt anyone else because of me." "With 3 babies? In your condition?" McKinnon shook his head. "That's suicide, ma'am, and you know it. Better than mass murder." Dr. Hennessy moved to his desk, pulling out a worn leather journal. "There might be another option," he said slowly. "A man I knew years ago, someone who understands these kinds of situations. He's not conventional, but he has resources and skills that ordinary law enforcement lacks." "What kind of man?" McKinnon asked. "The kind your grandmother would have warned you about in bedtime stories," the doctor replied grimly. "But also the kind who might be able to identify those birthmarks and explain why they've made these children targets." Clara felt a mixture of hope and dread. "Is he trustworthy?" "That depends entirely on your definition of trust. He's a man who keeps his word, but his word might not be what you expect to hear. He's helped people before, but his methods—" Hennessy closed the journal. "Let's just say he operates outside the boundaries of civilized society." "We're already outside those boundaries," McKinnon pointed out. "The law can't help us against whoever's hunting those babies. Hell, for all we know, the law might be part of the problem." Through the window, Clara could see the orange glow on the horizon where Martha Thompson's home burned. Another innocent person caught in the web of violence that seemed to follow these 3 sleeping children. How many more would die before? She found answers. Send for him, she decided. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, send for him. These children deserve to live, and everyone helping them deserves to know what they're facing. Dr. Hennessy nodded grimly. "I'll send word to Silas Kane in the morning. God help us all." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. McKinnon actually stepped backward, his face draining of color. "Silas Kane? Doc, you can't be serious. That man's a killer. They say he's tracked men across 3 territories and never once brought them back alive. They also say he never forgets a face, a name, or a mark," Hennessy replied quietly. "And right now those children need someone who understands the language of violence better than we do." Clara looked down at the 3 sleeping babies. There, tiny faces peaceful in the lamplight, unaware that their lives hung in the balance of decisions made by adults whose own futures had become equally uncertain. The crescent birthmark seemed to pulse with ominous significance in the flickering shadows. Somewhere out in the desert, men were riding closer, carrying death in their saddlebags and vengeance in their hearts. And soon, if Dr. Hennessy's message reached its destination, the most feared tracker in the American West, would be riding toward the Iron Cross Ranch with his own agenda. The question that haunted Clara as she prepared for what might be her last peaceful night was simple. When predators hunt predators, who protects the innocent caught between them? The Iron Cross Ranch had never seen a dawn quite like this one. Clara stood at the window of Dr. Hennessy's office, watching the horizon with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Somewhere out there, two forces were converging on their small sanctuary. The Mexican riders who had been systematically burning their way across the territory, and a man whose reputation made grown cowboys cross themselves when his name was spoken. It had been 36 hours since Dr. Hennessy sent his message. 36 hours of fortifying the ranch, moving the women and children to the most secure buildings, and preparing for what McKinnon grimly called the reckoning. The cowboys had transformed from cattle herders into soldiers overnight, checking their weapons with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that their lives now hung by threads thinner than spider silk. "Riders coming in from the east," called out Jimmy Torres from his perch in the ranch house tower. "Single man on a black horse, moving fast." McKinnon appeared at Clara's shoulder, his face etched with concern. Could be Kane, could be a scout. Oh, for the Mexicans. Either way, we're about to find out what we're really dealing with. Clara adjusted the baby girl in her arms. Little Emma, as Rosa had started calling her. The three children had been unusually restless all morning, as if they sensed the tension that crackled through the ranch like electricity before a thunderstorm. Their crescent birthmarks seemed more pronounced in the early light, darker and more defined than she remembered. The approaching rider crested the low rise that marked the eastern boundary of McKinnon's property, and Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Even at a distance, there was something unsettling about the figure. The way he sat his horse with predatory stillness, the deliberate pace that suggested absolute confidence in his ability to handle whatever awaited him. "That's him," Dr. Hennessy said quietly, joining them at the window. Silas Kane. As the rider drew closer, details emerged that made Clara's skin crawl. Kane was a man built for violence, tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of physical strength honed by years of hard living. His dark coat flapped behind him like wings, and the wide brim of his hat cast shadows that concealed his features. In an almost supernatural way, twin gun belts crossed his chest, and a rifle rode easy in a leather scabbard, all of it worn with the casual familiarity of a man who lived his life by the speed of his draw. But it was his horse that truly unsettled her. The animal was magnificent, a stallion black as midnight with eyes that seemed to hold their own intelligence. It moved with an almost unnatural grace, its hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. Together, horse and rider created an image that belonged more in nightmares than in the bright Arizona morning. "Sweet Mary," whispered Rosa, crossing herself, "he looks like death itself." Kane brought his mount to a halt in the ranch yard, 30 feet from the main house. For a long moment, he simply sat there, studying the building and its nervous occupants, with the calculating gaze of a man who missed nothing. When he finally dismounted, his movements were fluid and economical, every gesture purposeful. McKinnon stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Mr. Kane, thank you for coming." Kane's voice, when he spoke, carried the soft drawl of the deep South, but underneath lay something cold and sharp as a blade. "Clayton McKinnon, heard you've got yourself a situation that requires specialized attention." That would be putting it mildly. McKinnon gestured toward the door. "Why don't you come inside? There are people you need to meet." Kane's pale eyes swept the porch, taking in the boarded windows, the strategic positioning of McKinnon's men, the general atmosphere of a place under siege. "How many are hunting you?" "Near as we can tell, about a dozen. Maybe more. Mexican? Some. Others. look to be hired guns from who knows where. They're organized, well-armed, and they've been burning out anyone who might have helped the woman they're tracking. Kane's gaze shifted to the window where Clara stood holding Emma. Even through the glass, she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Those pale eyes seemed to look right through her, reading secrets she didn't even know she possessed. The woman with the children, Kane said. It wasn't a question, among others. Come inside, Kane. This is bigger than a simple tracking job. Kane tied his horse to the porch rail with movements that spoke of long practice. The stallion stood perfectly still, as if carved from shadow, its intelligent eyes watching everything with an alertness that made Clara's skin crawl. When Kane entered Dr. Hennessy's office, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was taller than she'd expected, with sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the coldness that emanated from him like winter fog. His pale eyes studied her and the babies with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of courtesy that seemed oddly out of place, coming from such a dangerous man. "Mr. Kane," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady, "thank you for coming. Haven't done anything yet worth thanking." His gaze moved to the babies, lingering on their faces with an expression she couldn't read. Dr. Hennessy's message mentioned birthmarks. Mind if I take a look? Clara hesitated. Something about Kane's interest in the marks made her profoundly uncomfortable, as if showing them to him would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But they'd called him here for his expertise, and backing down now would only waste the time. And they didn't have. She turned Emma so that her left ear was visible. Kane stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell leather and gunpowder and something else, something wild and dangerous that made her think of predators and midnight hunts. When Kane saw the crescent birthmark, his entire demeanor changed. The casual indifference vanished, replaced by something approaching shock. His pale eyes widened slightly, and for just a moment his carefully controlled mask slipped to reveal something that might have been fear. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, stepping backward as if the baby had burst into flames. "You recognize it," Dr. Hennessy said. "I knew you would." Kane's hand moved instinctively to his gun, not in threat but in the unconscious gesture of a man confronting something that had haunted his nightmares. "Where did you find these children?" "Stagecoach wreck," Clara said. "I don't remember much else." "You don't remember, or you don't want to remember?" Kane's voice had gone deadly quiet. "I have amnesia from a head injury. I can't remember anything. Before waking up in that destroyed coach with 3 babies crying in my arms." Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying the babies with an expression that had grown increasingly troubled. Finally, he looked up at the assembled group, his pale eyes holding knowledge that none of them wanted to hear. "These aren't just any children," he said slowly. "Those marks, they identify them as members of the Mendoza family, the most powerful crime dynasty in Mexico, with reach that extends all the way to Sacramento and beyond." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Crime dynasty. Smuggling, murder, extortion, human trafficking. If there's money in it and blood on it, the Mendozas have their fingers in it. Those birthmarks appear on every member of the main family line, passed down through generations like a brand. McKinnon cursed under his breath, which means the men hunting them are probably working for rival families looking to end the Mendoza line permanently. Kane's expression had grown grim. Or they're working for the Mendozas themselves, trying to recover stolen property. "Stolen property?" Clara's voice rose in outrage. "These are children, not property." Kane's pale eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "In the world these babies come from, there's not much difference. The question is, are you their protector or their kidnapper?" The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. Before she could respond, Jimmy Torres's voice rang out from the tower. "Riders on the horizon! Multiple horses coming from the north!" Kane moved to the window with fluid grace, his trained eyes assessing the approaching threat. 15 men, maybe 20. Professional killers by the look of them. He turned back to the room, his expression deadly serious. Whatever you folks thought you were dealing with, you were wrong. This is war. Through the window, Clara could see the dust cloud growing larger as their enemies approached. The final confrontation was upon them, and standing between 3 innocent babies and a small army of killers was a group of cowboys, a frontier doctor, and the most feared tracker in the American West, a man whose own agenda remained as mysterious as the children's true identity. Kane moved through the ranch house like a man preparing for battle, which Clara realized was exactly what he was doing. His pale eyes catalogued every window, every doorway, every piece of furniture that could serve as cover or concealment. The transformation from mysterious stranger to military tactician was both impressive and terrifying to witness. "McKinnon," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "How many men can you count on to stand and fight?" 8, including myself. All good shots, all steady under pressure. Against 20 professional killers, that's not enough. Kane pulled out a weathered map of the territory, spreading it across Dr. Hennessy's desk. "But we're not fighting a conventional battle. We're buying time and looking for advantages they won't expect." Clara watched him work, noting how his hands moved with practiced precision, marking defensive positions and escape routes with the expertise of someone who had faced similar odds before. "What kind of advantages?" Kane's pale eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "The kind that depend on you, telling me the truth about who you really are." "I've told you everything I remember." "Memory's a funny thing," Kane said, his voice soft but dangerous. "Sometimes it comes back all at once when the right pressure's applied." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the scars that marked his hands, evidence of a life lived by violence. 3 Mendoza children don't end up in a random woman's arms by accident. Someone chose you, specifically. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. Through the boarded windows, they could see the dust cloud resolving into individual riders, hard men on hard horses, armed for war and riding with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. "Everyone to positions," McKinnon ordered. His cowboys scattered with admirable discipline, taking up the defensive points they'd rehearsed over the past 2 days. Rosa hurried Clara and the babies toward the most secure room in the house, a windowless storage area that could serve as a last refuge if the outer defenses failed. Kane remained at the window, studying the approaching force with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating an enemy. "Interesting," he murmured. "What's interesting about 20 men coming to kill us?" Dr. Hennessy asked, checking his medical bag one final time. "The man leading them. That's not who I expected to see." Clara peered through a gap in the boards, trying to identify what had caught Kane's attention. The leader of the approaching force was indeed distinctive, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit that seemed wildly out of place in the Arizona desert. He rode with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command, but there was something civilized about him that didn't match her expectations of a desert killer. "Who is he?" she asked. "Eduardo Mendoza," Kane replied, his voice carrying a note of respect tinged with wariness. "Head of the family. If he's here personally, those babies aren't just important, they're irreplaceable." The implication hit Clara like a physical blow. They're his children. Grandchildren, more likely, which makes this situation infinitely more complicated. Kane checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. Eduardo Mendoza doesn't ride into the desert to recover stolen property. He's here for blood family. The approaching riders halted just outside rifle range, their formation suggesting military training rather than bandit opportunism. Eduardo Mendoza urged his horse forward, alone, until he was close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate danger. "I wish to speak with the woman," he called out, his English carrying only a slight accent. "I am not here for bloodshed if it can be avoided." McKinnon looked to Kane, who nodded grimly. "Let him talk. Sometimes talking reveals more than fighting." Clara moved to a window where she could be seen, the baby girl still in her arms. "I'm here." Eduardo's eyes fixed on the child with an intensity that transcended mere interest. Even at a distance, Clara could see recognition dawn on his weathered features. "My granddaughter," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and pain. "After so many months of searching." "Your granddaughter?" Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. "These children belong to you. They belong to the family, as do you, though you seem to have forgotten." The words struck Clara like lightning, illuminating corners of her damaged memory that had remained stubbornly dark. Images flashed through her mind. A wedding ceremony in a grand cathedral, a man with kind eyes placing a ring on her finger, 3 tiny babies being placed in her arms while someone whispered urgent instructions about protection and safety. "Clara." "Mendoza," Eduardo continued, his voice gentling, "my son's widow, my daughter-in-law, the woman I entrusted with my most precious treasures when the war began." The memories crashed over her like a dam breaking. Her husband Ricardo's assassination by rival families, the desperate flight from Sacramento with 3 newborn children, the stagecoach accident that was meant to cover their tracks, but instead left her with amnesia and no protection, save her own determination. "I remember," she whispered, then louder, "I remember!" Kane was studying her with those unsettling pale eyes. "So you're not a kidnapper, you're family." "I was protecting them," Clara said, the full weight of her responsibility settling on her, shoulders like a lead blanket. "Ricardo made me promise. If anything happened to him, I was to take the children somewhere safe, somewhere the family wars couldn't touch them." "And where exactly did you think would be safe from the Mendoza reach?" Eduardo called out. "There is nowhere in this territory, perhaps nowhere in this country, where family blood doesn't eventually call to family blood." Dr. Hennessy stepped forward. "Then why the violence? Why burn out innocent people?" Eduardo's expression hardened. "Because my daughter-in-law disappeared with 3 heirs to the Mendoza legacy, and in our world such disappearances are rarely innocent. The families would pay fortunes to see those children dead. Rivals would torture them for information about our operations. I had to assume the worst." "The men with you?" Kane said, his voice carrying deadly certainty. "They're not all Mendoza." "Soldiers." "No," Eduardo admitted, his tone growing grave. "Some are hired guns, yes, and some—" He paused significantly. "Some are representatives of families who would prefer my grandchildren never reach adulthood." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled defenders. They weren't just facing a family recovery operation, they were caught in the middle of a dynastic war where 3 innocent babies represented the future of a criminal empire. "What do you want?" Clara called out, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My grandchildren. Safe passage for you if you choose to return to the family. And," Eduardo's voice hardened, "the deaths of anyone who has harmed them or stands in the way of their return." McKinnon stepped into view, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "And if we refuse, then my men and I will take them by force, and you will all die in the process. But I would prefer not to explain to my grandchildren, when they are old enough to understand, why their protectors chose death over negotiation." Kane moved closer to Clara, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He's not bluffing. Mendoza family wars have wiped out entire towns. If we fight, everyone here dies. And if we surrender, you and the babies probably live. The rest," Kane shrugged, Witnesses to family business rarely see old age. Clara looked down at the three sleeping children, Emma and the two boys she'd started thinking of as Marcus and Samuel. They were so small, so innocent, completely unaware that their mere existence had sparked a conflict that could consume everyone around them. Through the window, she could see Eduardo waiting patiently for her decision. Behind him, his men sat, their horses with the stillness of professional killers, ready to transform from negotiators to executioners at a moment's notice. The choice before her was simple in its horror. Surrender the children to a grandfather who loved them but whose world was built on violence and death, or fight a battle that would certainly end with the deaths of everyone who had shown her kindness. But as she studied Eduardo's face, noting the genuine grief and longing in his eyes when he looked at the babies, Clara began to suspect there might be a third option. One that would require her to remember not just her past, but the skills and knowledge that had made Ricardo Mendoza choose her as his wife and the protector of his children. The war for the Mendoza legacy was about to begin, and Clara was starting to remember that she had never been just an innocent bystander in her husband's world. Clara stepped onto the porch of the Iron Cross Ranch, carrying Emma, while Rosa followed with the two boys. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, creating a stage for what would either be a family reunion or a massacre. Behind her, she could feel Cain's presence like a coiled spring, ready to unleash violence at the first sign of treachery. Eduardo Mendoza dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and respectful. But Clara's recovered memories painted a different picture of this man than his civilized appearance suggested. She remembered family dinners where he'd spoken casually of eliminating rivals, business meetings where he'd ordered deaths with the same tone other men used to discuss cattle prices. "Clara, mija," he said, using the Spanish endearment that triggered another cascade of memories. "You have done well. Ricardo would be proud of how you protected his children." "Our children," she corrected, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am their mother in every way that matters." Eduardo nodded, acknowledging the distinction. "Of course, and they will always know you as such, but they are also Mendoza blood with all that entails." Clara shifted Emma to her other arm, noting how the baby's eyes seemed to track the conversation with unusual awareness. All three children had been unusually alert since Eduardo's arrival, as if they sensed the significance of this moment. "The men with you," Clara said, her gaze sweeping the armed riders behind Eduardo. "Not all of them wear Mendoza colors." Eduardo's expression darkened slightly. "You always were perceptive. Yes, some of them represent interested parties, families who believe the Mendoza line should end with these children." "And you brought them here?" Clara's voice carried an edge of steel that surprised even her. "You led assassins directly to your grandchildren?" "Sometimes the best way to eliminate a threat is to bring it into the open, where it can be dealt with permanently." Eduardo's smile was cold as winter steel. "These men believe they are here to witness the recovery of three children who will soon meet with unfortunate accidents. They do not realize they are here to die." The casual mention of planned murder sent a chill through the assembled defenders. Clara realized that Eduardo hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to set a trap, using his own grandchildren as bait. Cain stepped forward, his pale eyes fixed on Eduardo with predatory intensity. "Silas Cain," he introduced himself. "I know your reputation, Mendoza, and you know mine." Eduardo's eyebrows rose slightly. "The ghost tracker. I wondered when our paths would cross." He studied Cain with professional interest. "Tell me, Senor Cain, what brings the most feared man in the territories to play nursemaid to my family?" "Professional curiosity," Cain replied smoothly, "and a desire to see how this particular game plays out." "Ah," but you are already a player. Whether you realize it or not, Eduardo's smile widened. Did you think Dr. Hennessy chose you at random? The good doctor has been on my payroll for 3 years, ensuring that certain information reaches certain ears when the time is right. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Dr. Hennessy, the man who had treated her injuries and shown such kindness, was a Mendoza agent. The revelation made her question everything that had happened since arriving at the ranch. "Doc?" McKinnon's voice carried betrayal and hurt. "Is that true?" Dr. Hennessy stepped forward, his face etched with what appeared to be genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Clayton, but my medical practice serves the entire territory, including areas where the Mendoza family has interests. Sometimes cooperation is the price of being allowed to heal the innocent." "You've been reporting on everyone who comes through here," Clara said, the pieces falling into place. "Every patient, every injury, every story of trouble in the territory. Information is currency in this business," Eduardo confirmed. "And Dr. Hennessy has been a reliable banker. When he sent word that a woman with amnesia had arrived carrying 3 babies with distinctive birthmarks, I knew my search was over. Kane's hand had moved to his gun, but he hadn't drawn. Clara could see him calculating odds, measuring distances, assessing the tactical situation with the cool precision of a professional killer. "How many of your men are actual Mendoza soldiers?" he asked Eduardo. 6. The others believe they're here to eliminate a threat to their own family's interests." Eduardo's expression grew predatory. "They have no idea they're about to become the eliminated threat." The casual discussion of mass murder crystallized Clara's decision. She couldn't allow the Iron Cross Ranch to become a battlefield where innocent people died for the crimes of the guilty, but neither could she surrender 3 children to a world of violence and death, even if that world claimed them by right of blood. "I have a proposition," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Eduardo tilted his head, genuinely curious. "I'm listening, Mija. Single combat. You choose your best fighter, I choose mine. Winner takes all. The children, the ranch, and the right to determine who lives and who dies." A murmur ran through both groups of armed men. In the world of the frontier, such challenges carried weight beyond mere bravado. They were tests of honor, skill, and divine favor that even hardened killers respected. Eduardo laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "You would risk everything on a single fight that is either very brave or very foolish." "It's practical," Clara replied. "You want your grandchildren. I want them safe. A battle here guarantees casualties on both sides, including potential harm. To the babies, single combat resolves the matter with minimal bloodshed. And who would you choose as your champion?" Eduardo's eyes flicked to Kane. "The ghost tracker, perhaps?" Clara's next words surprised everyone, including herself. "I choose myself." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. "Clara, no," McKinnon said, his voice tight with concern. "You've been through too much. You're not in any condition to—" "I'm in perfect condition to protect my children," Clara interrupted, "and I have skills that most of you have forgotten I possess." Eduardo studied her with new interest. "Ricardo did mention that his bride was unconventional. He said you could handle a gun and a knife better than most men. He said I could handle them better than any man," Clara corrected, "including his personal bodyguards." Kane's pale eyes narrowed as he reassessed her. "You're not just a grieving widow hiding from family politics. You were an active participant." Ricardo's business required certain skills from his wife. Social graces, yes, but also the ability to defend herself and their interests when necessary. Clara's voice carried steel now, and memories flooded back. Late-night training sessions, target practice in hidden locations, lessons in combat both armed and unarmed. "I may have forgotten who I was, but my body remembers what it learned. Eduardo nodded slowly, respect replacing amusement in his expression. And if you lose, then the children go with you, and everyone else here lives. You have my word. And if you win? Clara looked down at the three babies, their innocent faces turned up toward her. Then we all leave here alive, and you give us a year's head start before any Mendoza comes looking for them again. A year is not long in family terms, Eduardo warned. It's long enough, Clara replied with quiet confidence. Long enough for them to be somewhere even the Mendoza reach can't. Find them. Eduardo was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter-in-law with the calculating gaze of a man who had built an empire on reading people correctly. Finally, he nodded. Very well. Single combat it is. He turned to his men, pointing to a figure Clara hadn't noticed before. A massive man with scars covering his arms and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Miguel Santos, 20 years as a pit fighter in Mexico City, 57 kills in single combat. Santos, dismounted with fluid grace despite his size, drawing a pair of wicked-looking knives from his belt. His smile revealed gold teeth that glinted in the afternoon sun. Clara handed Emma to Rosa, then turned to Kane. I'll need to borrow your guns. Kane's pale eyes studied her with new understanding. Both of them? Both of them, and any knives. You might have to spare. As Kane began unbuckling his gun belts, Clara felt the final pieces of her memory clicking into place. She wasn't just Clara Mendoza, grieving widow and protective mother. She was Clara Mendoza, the woman who had earned her place in a violent world through skill, determination, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect those she loved. The children's birthmarks had made them targets, but they had also given her the motivation to remember who she truly was. Now, with the desert sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, she would either prove worthy of that inheritance or die trying. The makeshift arena was nothing more than a circle of dust marked by boots and spurs, but it might as well have been the Colosseum in Rome. 24 armed men formed a loose perimeter around the combat zone, their faces displaying the hungry anticipation of spectators about to witness something primal and final. Clara stood at one edge of the circle, Kane's twin gun belts crossed over her chest, the weight of the weapons both familiar and foreign. Her hands remembered the balance of steel and leather, even as her conscious mind struggled to recall when she'd last worn such armament. Miguel Santos waited at the opposite end, his massive frame relaxed but ready, those wicked knives spinning lazily in his scarred hands. Traditional rules, Eduardo announced, his voice carrying the formality of a man who had overseen many such contests. No quarter asked or given. Combat continues until one fighter yields or dies. All weapons drawn at the start remain legal throughout. Clara nodded, her fingers finding the familiar grips of Kane's Colts. The revolvers felt like extensions of her hands, and suddenly she could remember Ricardo laughing as he watched her outshoot his best men, could recall the pride in his voice when he told his father that his bride could handle any threat that came her way. Santos spoke for the first time, his voice a bass rumble that seemed to emanate from deep within his barrel chest. Senora, you are very brave or very stupid. I have killed women before. It brings me no pleasure, but I do not hesitate. Good, Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Neither do I. McKinnon stepped forward, his face etched with concern. Clara, you don't have to do this. We can fight our way out, make a run for— No! Clara's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Too many good people have already died because of these children. This ends here. One way or another. She looked toward Rosa, who held the three babies with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Emma was awake, her tiny eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. For just a moment, Clara could have sworn she saw recognition in that infant gaze, not just of a caretaker, but of someone preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Kane moved to Clara's side, his pale eyes studying Santos with professional assessment. "He's good," he said quietly. "Better than good, but he's also arrogant, and arrogance creates opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" "He's a pit fighter, used to crowds and contained spaces. Out here in the open, he might not adjust his spacing correctly. Use that. And remember, you're not fighting to kill him quickly. You're fighting to survive long enough to find your opening." Clara nodded, absorbing the tactical advice, even as another part of her mind catalogued the watching faces around the circle. Some of Eduardo's men looked genuinely conflicted, as if they weren't entirely comfortable with watching their patron's daughter-in-law risk her life. Others, the ones Eduardo had identified as rival family representatives, watched with barely concealed eagerness, clearly hoping to see the end of the Mendoza bloodline's protector. "Fighters ready?" Eduardo called out. Santos dropped into a combat crouch, his knives held in a professional grip that spoke of decades of experience. His scarred face split into a gold-toothed grin as he began a slow, predatory circle around the perimeter of their impromptu arena. Clara drew both Colts simultaneously, the motion smooth as silk, despite her months away from practice. The familiar weight of the weapons in her hands seemed to unlock something primal in her muscle memory, and suddenly she wasn't just Clara the amnesia victim or Clara the protective mother. She was Clara Mendoza, the woman who had earned her place in a violent world through skill and determination. "Begin." Eduardo's voice cracked like a whip. Santos moved with surprising speed for such a large man, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. His right hand swept up in a vicious arc, the knife blade catching the afternoon sun as it sliced through the air where Clara's throat had been a split second before. Clara twisted away from the attack, her body remembering defensive patterns even as her mind struggled to keep up. She brought her left-hand Colt around in a tight arc, not firing, but using the heavy barrel as a club that caught Santos on the wrist with enough force to make him grunt and stumble backward. The crowd around the circle stirred, murmurs of appreciation rising from both sides. Santos shook his injured wrist, his grin widening with what might have been respect or anticipation. "Muy bien, señora. You have some skill after all." He came at her again, this time with a more measured approach. His knives wove patterns in the air between them, creating a steel barrier that made it impossible for Clara to get a clear shot without risking her own safety. She backpedaled steadily, her boots finding secure footing on the hard-packed earth, while her eyes tracked the deadly dance of his blades. Santos feinted left, then lunged right, his blade carving a shallow line across Clara's upper arm before she could twist completely away. Blood bloomed through the fabric of her borrowed dress, but the pain seemed to sharpen her focus rather than distract from it. Now she remembered. Pain was just information. Ricardo had taught her. It told you where you'd made mistakes and how to avoid making them again. The shallow cut on her arm informed her that Santos was faster than she'd calculated, but also that his killing stroke had missed by inches. Clara fired her right-hand Colt, not at Santos, but at the ground near his feet. The bullet kicked up a cloud of dust and grit that made him blink instinctively, and in that split second of visual confusion, she moved. Her left-hand gun came up and across, the barrel catching Santos across the bridge of his nose with a wet crack that sent blood streaming down his face. He roared in pain and rage, slashing wildly with both knives, but Clara was already rolling away, coming up in a new position with both guns trained on his center mass. "First blood to the Senora!" someone called out from the crowd, though Clara, I couldn't identify the voice through the rushing of adrenaline in her ears. Santos wiped blood from his eyes, his expression shifting from confident amusement to deadly seriousness. When he looked at Clara now, she could see the predator emerging fully, all pretense of civilized combat falling away to reveal the pit fighter who had killed 57 men with blade and fist. "No more games," he growled, and suddenly he was moving again, not the calculated advance of before, but an all-out assault designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer ferocity. Clara fired both guns simultaneously, the reports echoing across the desert like thunder. Santos jerked as one bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him partially around, but his momentum carried him forward. The second shot missed entirely, and then he was inside her defensive perimeter, too close for firearms to be effective. His left-hand knife swept up toward her ribs, while his right sought her throat. Clara dropped both guns and threw herself backward, feeling steel part the air inches from her face. She rolled desperately, her hands finding the backup knife Kane had given her, just as Santos's boot stamped down where her head had been. Now, they were both on equal terms, blade to blade, skill against skill, with no advantages save those they could create through superior technique and deadlier intent. Santos's greater size and reach gave him obvious advantages, but Clara's speed and recovering memories began to level the odds. She remembered now hours of training with Ricardo's weapons master, learning to fight not like a woman trying to match a man's strength, but like a predator using every advantage available. Speed over power, precision over brute force, intelligence over aggression. Santos pressed his attack, his knives working in deadly concert, but Clara found her rhythm. She gave ground when she had to, took it when she could, always moving, always thinking, always looking for the opening that would end this dance of death in her favor. The crowd around them had fallen silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare. Two master fighters operating at the peak of their abilities, neither giving quarter, both willing to die rather than yield. As the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the makeshift arena, Clara felt her memories crystallizing into perfect clarity. She remembered who she was, what she was capable of, and most importantly, what she was fighting for. 3 innocent children whose only crime was bearing the wrong birthmarks. A group of cowboys who had risked their lives to help a stranger. Her own right to choose a different path than the one blood and violence had laid out for her. Santos came at her again, his attacks growing more desperate as fatigue began to tell on his larger frame. Clara saw her opening, a split second when his guard dropped after a particularly aggressive combination, and took it. The outcome of the fight and the fate of everyone watching hung in the balance of that single decisive moment. Clara's blade found its mark with surgical precision, sliding between Santos's ribs and piercing his heart with a whisper of steel through flesh. The massive pit fighter's eyes widened in shock, not at the pain he'd endured worse, but at the perfect technique of the killing stroke. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just the clean efficiency of a master at work. "Impossible," he breathed, blood frothing at his lips. "You fight like him." "Like who?" Clara asked, supporting his weight as he sagged against her. "El Fantasma, the ghost of Guadalajara. He taught you." Santos's gold teeth gleamed one last time as he managed a final smile. "I die honored, Senora. You are worthy." Miguel Santos, 57 kills to his name, collapsed into the Arizona dust. The crowd around the circle stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Clara Mendoza, amnesia victim, desperate mother, grieving widow, had just defeated one of the deadliest fighters in Mexico in single combat. Eduardo stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he looked down at Santos's body. "Well fought, mija. Your husband would be proud." He raised his voice to address the assembled men. "The terms are met. Single combat, winner takes all." But even as he spoke, Clara could see the tension in the rival family representatives. These men hadn't ridden hundreds of miles through hostile territory to watch their target walk away free. Their hands were moving toward their weapons, their eyes calculating distances and angles. Kane appeared at Clara's shoulder, as if materializing from shadows. "We've got problems," he said quietly. "Half of Eduardo's riders are reaching for iron. This was never going to end with just one fight." Clara wiped Santos's blood from her knife, her newly recovered memories providing tactical assessment with crystal clarity. "How many are true Mendoza loyalists? 6, maybe 7. The rest are here to see those babies dead, and they're not going to honor any agreement that keeps them breathing." Eduardo must have reached the same conclusion, because his own hand moved to his gun even as he maintained his grandfatherly demeanor. "Gentlemen," he said to the rival family men, "I believe our business here is concluded." "Not quite," replied a lean man with cold eyes and expensive clothes. "The children still breathe, which means the Vasquez family debt remains unpaid." Another man, this one bearing the distinctive facial tattoos of the Herrera clan, nodded agreement. "3 generations of Mendoza blood have cost us too much. This ends today." "Over my dead body," Clara said, stepping forward with Kane's recovered Colts in her hands. The Herrera enforcer laughed. "That can be arranged, Senora." The standoff stretched taut as a violin string, 20 men with guns drawn facing each other across the dusty ranch yard. The slightest provocation would turn the Iron Cross into a killing field, with innocent cowboys caught in the crossfire between Mexican crime families. That's when Dr. Hennessy did something that surprised everyone, including himself. The elderly physician stepped between the armed factions, his medical bag in one hand and a double-barreled shotgun in the other. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority none of them had heard before. "I've spent 3 years reporting to the Mendoza family, it's true, but I've also been documenting every crime, every murder, every dirty transaction that's crossed my desk." He opened his medical bag with deliberate care, revealing not just surgical instruments, but also a thick stack of documents. Detailed records of who ordered what killings, when, and why. Financial transactions, shipping manifests for human cargo, names, dates, and enough evidence to hang half the crime bosses from here to Mexico City. Eduardo's face went pale. "Doctor, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago. These papers are already copied and deposited with federal marshals in 3 different territories. If anything happens to these children, to Clara, or to anyone else on this ranch, those documents become public record." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. In the world of organized crime, exposure was often worse than death. Families could survive the loss of soldiers, even important ones, but they couldn't survive having their operations laid bare for law enforcement. The Vasquez enforcer's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing, old man." "Am I?" Hennessy pulled out a single document, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is a shipping manifest for a cargo of Chinese girls brought through San Francisco last year. Notice the signature at the bottom? That's your patron's handwriting, authorizing payment for human property." The man's face went ashen. Such evidence, in the wrong hands, would not only destroy the Vasquez operations, but potentially spark international incidents with the Chinese government. "You see, gentlemen," Hennessy continued, "I've been insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The Mendoza family pays me to gather information, yes, but they also pay me to ensure that certain complications don't arise that might threaten their broader interests." Clara began to understand the deeper game being played. Dr. Hennessy hadn't just been a simple informant. He'd been Eduardo's insurance policy against the very situation they now faced. The threat of mutual destruction through exposure. Eduardo slowly holstered his weapon, his expression shifting to one of grudging respect. "Doctor, you continue to surprise me." Very well. He turned to the rival family representatives. Gentlemen, it appears we have reached what the Americans call a Mexican standoff. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative arrangements. What kind of arrangements? The Herrera enforcer asked suspiciously. The children disappear, Eduardo said simply. Not killed, disappeared. New identities, new lives, far from family politics. The Mendoza name dies with them, but so does the threat they represent to your families. Clara felt her heart sink. It was a reasonable compromise from a criminal perspective. The children would live, but they would never know their heritage, never understand who they really were or why they bore those distinctive birthmarks. No, she said firmly, they're my children now, not bargaining chips in your family wars. Eduardo's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or admiration. Mija, you cannot protect them forever. Someday they'll be old enough to make their own choices about what family means, Clara interrupted. But until then, they're under my protection, and I decide what's best for them. Kane stepped forward, his pale eyes surveying the assembled criminals with predatory calm. The lady's made her position clear. Now you all need to decide whether you're willing to test her resolve. The Vasquez enforcer looked from Kane to Clara to the damning documents in Dr. Hennessy's hands. Finally, he spat in the dust and holstered his weapon. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Clara replied. It ends here, today, with this understanding. These children are under my protection, backed by Dr. Hennessy's insurance policy. Anyone who threatens them threatens to expose everyone else's operations. Mutual destruction, as he called it. One by one, the rival family men mounted their horses and rode away, taking their dreams of vengeance with them. Eduardo watched them, then turned back to Clara with an expression of profound sadness. You realize what you've done, Mija. You've made yourself a target for the rest of your life. I was already a target, Clara replied. Now I'm a target with options. Eduardo nodded slowly, then walked to where Rosa held the 3 babies. He looked down at his grandchildren for a long moment, his weathered face soft with genuine love. May I? He asked, extending his arms toward Emma. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Eduardo lifted the baby girl with surprising gentleness, his eyes misting as he studied her tiny features. She has her father's eyes, he whispered, and her grandmother's stubborn chin. He kissed Emma's forehead, then handed her back to Rosa. Take care of them, Clara. Teach them to be better than the blood they carry. I will, Clara promised. Eduardo mounted his horse, then paused. There will be others who come looking eventually. The family wars don't end just because we call a truce today. Then I'll be ready for them, Clara replied. All of us will. As Eduardo and his remaining men rode away into the gathering dusk, Clara felt the weight of the day's events settling on her shoulders. She had recovered her memory, won a fight to the death, and negotiated a fragile peace that might last months or years or merely days. But she had also gained something more, valuable than security. She had gained the certainty of who she was and what she was willing to fight for. Clara Mendoza was no longer the amnesia victim who had stumbled out of the desert. She was a mother, a protector, and a woman who had chosen love over vengeance, family over blood. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she gathered the 3 children in her arms and walked toward the ranch house, ready to begin building a new kind of family. One based not on birthmarks or criminal legacy, but on the simple human commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. 3 months had passed since the showdown at the Iron Cross Ranch, and Clara Mendoza had learned that peace was far more challenging than war. The children had thrived under Rosa's devoted care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day, but Clara found herself restless in ways she hadn't expected. She stood on the porch of the small house McKinnon had built for them on the far edge of his property, watching the three toddlers play in the carefully fenced yard. Emma had taken her first steps the week before, followed quickly by Marcus and Samuel, as if the triplets were determined to meet every milestone together. Their distinctive crescent birthmarks had faded slightly, but remained visible reminders of the heritage they would someday need to understand. "Penny for your thoughts," Kane said, appearing beside her with that unsettling ability he had to move without sound. The tracker had remained at the ranch far longer than anyone expected, claiming he was resting between jobs, though Clara suspected his motivations were more complex. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Clara replied, watching Emma toddle toward a butterfly with determined concentration. "The children are safe for now, but for now isn't enough anymore." Kane leaned against the porch railing, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with professional habit. "Trouble coming?" "Not the kind you're thinking of. Dr. Hennessy's insurance policy is holding. No family has made a move against us since Eduardo left. But the children are growing, and soon they'll start asking questions I'm not sure how to answer." "About their father? Their grandfather?" Clara nodded. "About why we live apart from other people, why Rosa crosses herself when strangers ask their names, why you always carry enough guns to arm a small militia." She glanced at Kane's ever-present weapons. "They're smart children, Kane. Smarter than most adults I've known. They're going to figure out something isn't normal about their lives." Kane was quiet for a moment, considering. "You thinking about leaving Arizona?" "I'm thinking about giving them a choice," Clara said carefully, "when they're old enough to understand what it means." A dust cloud on the horizon caught their attention, and both adults tensed automatically. But as the rider drew closer, Clara recognized the familiar figure of Jimmy Torres, one of McKinnon's cowboys, who often served as messenger between the main ranch and their secluded home. "Mrs. Mendoza," Jimmy called out as he dismounted, his face flushed with excitement. "Got news from town. Big news." Clara felt her stomach tighten. In their world, big news was rarely good news. "What kind of news, Jimmy?" "Railroads coming through. They're going to build a depot in Copper Ridge, maybe extend the line all the way to California. McKinnon says it'll change everything, bring proper law, proper schools, proper civilization to the territory." Kane snorted. Civilization's got a way of bringing its own problems. But Clara felt something stir in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or possibility. A railroad meant connections to the wider world, opportunities for the children that went beyond the narrow confines of frontier life. It also meant escape routes if the fragile peace Eduardo had negotiated ever collapsed. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "Territorial governors planning to visit when they break ground. Governor Murphy himself, with a whole entourage from back east. They're looking for local families to host dignitaries, show off how civilized and prosperous the territory's become." Clara and Kane exchanged glances. The idea of the Mendoza family hosting territorial officials was either brilliantly perfect cover or a recipe for disaster. "McKinnon put your name forward," Jimmy added. "Said you and the children would represent the kind of family the territory wants to attract. Educated, respectable, hard-working." After Jimmy left, Clara found herself pacing the small living room while the children napped. The railroad represented opportunity, but it also meant scrutiny. Government officials asking questions, conducting background checks, potentially uncovering connections that were better left buried. "You're thinking..." "Too hard," Kane observed from his position by the window, where he maintained his eternal watch. "Someone has to. These children deserve better than spending their lives looking over their shoulders, but I can't give them that if I make the wrong choice." What would Ricardo have wanted for them? The question stopped Clara's pacing. She'd avoided thinking about her dead husband's wishes, focusing instead on immediate survival and safety. But Kane was right. Ricardo had made her their guardian for a reason. He wanted them free, she said slowly. Free from the family business, free from the violence, free to choose their own paths. She looked toward the bedroom where the children slept. He used to talk about buying a ranch in California, raising cattle instead of running guns. Said maybe his children could grow up without blood on their hands. California's not that far anymore, if the railroad comes through. Clara studied Kane's profile, noting the way his eyes never stopped moving, never stopped assessing threats. What about you? When the railroad brings proper law enforcement, men like you won't be as welcome in places like this. Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. Men like me go where we're needed, Mrs. Mendoza, and there's always somewhere that needs us. That evening, as Clara tucked the children into their cribs, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible. 3 months earlier, she was going to accept McKinnon's offer to host railroad officials. More than that, she was going to use the opportunity to build a new identity for herself and the children, one that honored their past without being trapped by it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Hennessy arrived in his medical wagon, but instead of his usual professional demeanor, he seemed almost excited. "Clara, my dear, I have a proposition for you." She invited him inside, noting how the children immediately gravitated toward the kindly doctor who had delivered several babies in the area since their arrival. The Territorial Medical Board is establishing new requirements for frontier physicians, Hennessy explained. They want local practitioners to have assistants, people trained in basic medical care who can serve isolated communities. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a profession, a respectable identity that explains your education and capabilities without raising uncomfortable questions about your past." Hennessy's eyes twinkled. "Think about it. Clara Sullivan, frontier nurse and mother of 3. No one questions why a medical professional might be well-traveled or why she might need to protect her family's privacy." The name change was brilliant in its simplicity. Sullivan instead of Mendoza, a subtle alteration that maintained her connection to her deceased first husband Thomas Sullivan while severing obvious ties to the crime family that had shaped her life. What about the children's names? Emma, Marcus, and Samuel Sullivan. 3 orphans you took in after their parents died in that stagecoach accident. Perfectly plausible, perfectly respectable. Clara considered the proposal carefully. It offered legitimacy, purpose, and a way to serve the community that had protected them. More importantly, it gave the children a story they could be proud of rather than ashamed of. "There's one condition," she said finally. "Name it." Kane stays. As part of the arrangement, frontier medical work is dangerous. We need protection, and he needs a legitimate reason to remain in the territory. Hennessy glanced toward the porch where Kane sat, cleaning his weapons with methodical precision. What would his role be? Security consultant, scout. Whatever title makes the territorial officials comfortable with having him around. "And you think he'll agree to this domestic arrangement?" Clara smiled. "I think Silas Kane is tired of being alone, even if he won't admit it. This gives him a family to protect without asking him to change who he is." That afternoon, Clara presented the proposal to Kane, expecting resistance or skepticism. Instead, he listened quietly, asked practical questions about logistics and security, and finally nodded. "Sullivan's a good name," he said. "Clean, simple, no ghosts attached to it. So you'll stay?" Kane looked toward the children, who were attempting to teach Emma how to stack wooden blocks. For just a moment, his pale eyes softened with something that might have been longing. "Someone's got to keep you all out of trouble," he said gruffly. "Might as well be me." As the sun set over the Arizona Territory that evening, Clara Sullivan, no longer Clara Mendoza, stood on her porch with her 3 children and the most dangerous man in the American West, planning a future none of them could have imagined 6 months earlier. The railroad would bring change, opportunity, and new challenges. But for the first time since waking up with amnesia in that destroyed stagecoach, Clara felt ready to meet whatever came next. She had recovered her memory, her skills, and her purpose. More importantly, she had discovered that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about the choice to stand together against whatever darkness the world might bring. The children's birthmarks would always be part of their story, but they no longer defined it. They were Emma, Marcus, and Samuel Sullivan now, children of the frontier with a future as wide and promising as the endless Arizona sky. 5 years later, spring 1893. The steam whistle of the westbound train echoed across the Arizona Territory. As Clara Sullivan stood on the platform of Copper Ridge's brand-new depot, her hand shading her eyes against the morning sun. The railroad had indeed changed everything, just as Jimmy Torres had predicted years ago. What had once been a dusty frontier town was now a thriving community with proper schools, telegraph lines, and even a small hospital where Clara served. As head nurse, beside her, 8-year-old Emma bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement, her dark hair braided with ribbons that matched her Sunday dress. "Is that the one, Mama Clara? The train that's taking us to California?" "That's the one, sweetheart," Clara replied, though her stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. This journey represented everything she'd worked toward. For 5 years, giving the children a chance to understand their true heritage and make their own choices about their future. Marcus and Samuel flanked their sister, both boys having grown tall and strong despite their relatively young age. Their resemblance to their deceased father Ricardo was becoming more pronounced with each passing year, and Clara sometimes caught glimpses of Eduardo Mendoza in their serious expressions when they thought no one was watching. "Mr. Kane says California has mountains that touch the clouds," Marcus said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that had always marked him as the most introspective of the three. "And an ocean so big you can't see the other side," Samuel added, his eyes bright with the adventurous spirit that reminded Clara why Ricardo had fallen in love with life itself, even in the midst of his family's dark business. Kane emerged from the ticket office, his distinctive black coat now paired with a respectable vest and the silver badge of a territorial deputy marshal, a position he'd accepted reluctantly when Governor Murphy insisted that the railroad needed proper law enforcement. The transformation from feared tracker to legitimate lawman had been gradual but complete, though Clara suspected he still missed the freedom of his previous life. "All arranged," he said, handing Clara their travel documents. "Private compartment, meals included, and I've sent word ahead to our contact in San Francisco." The contact was Dr. Hennessy's former colleague, a physician named Marcus Webb, who had agreed to facilitate what Clara privately thought of as the revelation, the carefully planned meeting that would allow the children to learn about their biological grandfather without putting anyone in danger. Eduardo Mendoza had honored his word for 5 years, making no attempt to contact or claim his grandchildren. But Clara had received periodic reports through Dr. Hennessy's network, updates on the old man's declining health and his repeated requests for just one meeting with the children he'd last seen as helpless infants. "Are you certain about this, Clara?" Dr. Hennessy asked, approaching their small group with his medical bag and travel case. Despite being well into his 70s, the old physician had insisted on accompanying them, claiming someone needed to monitor Eduardo's health during what might be their final meeting. "I'm certain the children deserve to know," Clara replied, watching as Emma helped Samuel adjust his new suspenders. "They've started asking questions I can't answer about why they look different from other children in town, why certain visitors to the hospital stare at them with recognition they're too young to understand." It was true. The children's distinctive features, combined with their unusual intelligence and the unconscious way they moved with a grace that spoke of hidden strength, had begun attracting attention. Last month, a Mexican trader had spent an entire afternoon studying Marcus before finally approaching Clara with carefully veiled questions about the boy's parentage. "The birthmarks are fading," Kane observed, his pale eyes studying the children with professional assessment, "but not disappearing. Someone who knows what to look for could still identify them." Clara nodded grimly. The crescent-shaped marks that had once been so prominent were now barely visible, like old scars touched by sunlight, but she'd learned that certain people, those connected to the old criminal families, could recognize the Mendoza bloodline in other ways. The set of the jaw, the particular shade of brown in their eyes, the way they held themselves even in childhood. The train's whistle sounded again, and passengers began boarding. Clara gathered the children, her heart heavy with the weight of decisions she'd been forced to make without their input. At 8 years old, they were still too young to fully understand the implications of their heritage, but old enough to sense that this journey represented something momentous. As they settled into their private compartment, Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the familiar landscape of Arizona begin to slide past. "Will we come back home, Mama Clara?" "This will always be your home, sweetheart," Clara assured her, "no matter where else we go or what else we learn." The journey to California took 3 days, during which Clara found herself alternating between nervous anticipation and profound regret. Was she doing the right thing by exposing the children to their grandfather's world, or was she selfishly seeking absolution for the choices she'd made on their behalf? Kane seemed to sense her internal struggle. On the second evening, as the children slept in their berths and the train rolled through the Nevada desert, he joined her in the small seating area of their compartment. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," Clara admitted. "What if seeing Eduardo awakens something in them that's better left sleeping? What if they choose his world over the one we've built?" "Then they choose," Kane said simply. "That's what you've been working toward all these years, giving them the right to choose." "I know, it's just—" Clara stared out at the moonlit desert, so different from the Arizona landscape that had become home. "I love them as if they were my own blood. The thought of losing them to a life I fought so hard to escape." "You won't lose them," Kane said with quiet certainty. "You've given them something Eduardo never could, the knowledge that family is about love and protection, not just blood and obligation. Whatever they choose, that foundation will remain." San Francisco greeted them with fog and salt air, a dramatic contrast to the dry heat of Arizona. Dr. Webb met them at the depot, a distinguished man in his 60s whose resemblance to Dr. Hennessy was immediately apparent in his gentle manner and careful attention to the children's comfort. "The arrangements are made," he said as they rode through the city in his carriage. "Mr. Mendoza is staying at a private residence in the hills. Neutral ground, you might say. No family associates, no business considerations, just a grandfather, hoping to meet his grandchildren." The house was modest by San Francisco standards, but luxurious compared to frontier accommodations. Built in the Spanish style with white walls and red tile roof, it sat on a hillside overlooking the bay. Gardens bloomed with flowers Clara had never seen, and the sound of the ocean provided a constant, soothing background. Eduardo Mendoza waited in the garden, and Clara was shocked by how much he'd aged in 5 years. The man who had once commanded respect through fear and authority now appeared frail, his silver hair gone completely white, his face marked by illness and what might have been regret. But when he saw the children, his transformation was immediate and profound. His eyes lit up with pure joy, and for a moment Clara saw not the head of a criminal dynasty, but simply an old man meeting his beloved grandchildren for what might be the last time. "Emma, Marcus, Samuel," he said their names like a prayer, his voice thick with emotion. "You have grown so beautiful, so strong." The children regarded him with the polite curiosity they showed all adults, unaware that they were meeting blood family. Clara had prepared them for this moment, explaining that they would meet an elderly gentleman who had known their parents, but she hadn't revealed the full truth of the relationship. "Are you really our grandfather?" Emma asked with typical directness, apparently having connected details from Clara's careful explanations. Eduardo glanced at Clara, who nodded permission. "Yes, pequeña, I am your father's father, your abuelo." "Why haven't we met you before?" Marcus asked, his serious expression matching Eduardo's own. "Because—" Eduardo paused, clearly struggling with how to explain complex adult realities to children. "Because your Mama Clara wanted to keep you safe, and sometimes being safe means staying away from family." Over the next 3 days, Eduardo spent every possible moment with his grandchildren, teaching them Spanish words, telling them carefully edited stories about their father's childhood, and showing them the kind of grandfather's love that transcended the dark realities of his professional life. Clara watched these interactions with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. She could see how much Eduardo loved the children, and how much they were beginning to love him in return. But she could also see the subtle ways he was testing them, evaluating their intelligence, their potential, their fitness for the world. He represented. On the final evening, after the children had gone to bed, Eduardo asked to speak with Clara privately. They walked in the garden as fog rolled in from the bay, transforming the city below into a dreamscape of lights and shadows. "They are remarkable children," Eduardo said. "Intelligent, strong, but also kind. You have raised them well, mija." "They've raised themselves mostly," Clara replied. "I just tried to keep them safe and give them options." "About those options." Eduardo paused by a fountain, its water catching moonlight like scattered diamonds. "I want you to know that I understand. Now, why Ricardo chose you, not just as his wife, but as their protector?" Clara waited, sensing something important was coming. "The family business is changing," Eduardo continued. "The old ways, the violence, the constant warfare between families. It's destroying everything. I tried to build. My health is failing, and I have no other heirs. When I die, the Mendoza legacy dies with me." "Unless the children choose to continue it," Clara said quietly. "Unless they choose to continue it," Eduardo agreed. "But I find myself hoping they will not." The admission shocked Clara. This was Eduardo Mendoza, who had built a criminal empire spanning multiple territories, admitting that he hoped his own legacy would end. "You've shown them a different way," he continued. "A way to be strong without being violent, to protect without destroying, to love without possessing. These are lessons I never learned, never taught my own son." Tears ran down his weathered cheeks as he spoke. "Ricardo died because of choices I made, enemies I created, debts I incurred. But his children, they can choose differently." "What are you saying, Eduardo?" "I'm saying that when I die, which will be soon, the Mendoza name and fortune will die with me. No inheritance for the children, no claims on their loyalty, no obligations to carry forward what I've built. They will be free to be whoever they choose to be." Clara felt a weight she'd carried for 8 years finally lift from her shoulders. "You're giving up your legacy to give them their freedom, a grandfather's final gift," Eduardo said softly. "The one thing I can give them that Ricardo never had, a choice." The next morning brought their final goodbye. Eduardo held each child in turn, whispering words in Spanish that Clara didn't translate but understood in her heart. Then he handed Clara a sealed envelope. "For when they're older," he said, "the truth about their father, their family, and why their choices matter more than their blood. The train journey back to Arizona was subdued, the children processing their encounter with a grandfather they would likely never see again. But as the familiar landscape came into view, Clara sensed their relief at returning to the only home they truly remembered. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their house outside Copper Ridge, Emma asked the question Clara had been expecting. "Mama Clara, are we going to become like Abuelo when we grow up?" Clara considered her answer carefully. "You're going to become whoever you choose to become, sweetheart. The blood in your veins doesn't determine your choices. Your heart does." "What? If we choose wrong?" Samuel asked. "Then you make different choices," Cain said from his position by the door, his eternal vigil maintained even in this moment of family conversation. "That's what growing up means, learning from mistakes and choosing again." Marcus, always the most thoughtful, had remained quiet throughout the exchange. Finally, he spoke. "I think I want to be a doctor, like Dr. Hennessy and Dr. Webb. Help people instead of hurt them. I want to be a teacher," Emma declared, "and teach children to make good choices." "I want to be like Mr. Cain," Samuel said, causing the adults to exchange glances. "Strong enough to protect people, but only using that strength when it's right." Clara smiled, recognizing in their words the values she and Cain and the entire Copper Ridge community had worked to instill. They were choosing their own paths, just as she'd always hoped they would. 6 months later, a telegram arrived from San Francisco. Eduardo Mendoza had died peacefully in his sleep, taking with him the secrets and debts of a criminal empire that would never be rebuilt. The children mourned the grandfather they'd barely known, but their grief was clean, uncomplicated by obligations or expectations. On Eduardo's first anniversary, Clara opened the envelope he'd given her. Inside was a letter addressed to Emma, Marcus, and Samuel for when they came of age, along with documents transferring legal ownership of a small ranch in Northern California, not criminal proceeds, but legitimate property Eduardo had purchased, with money earned through honest cattle trading in his final years. "Your choice," the letter read in Eduardo's careful handwriting. "A place to build something new if you want it, or sell it and use the money for whatever future you choose. Your father's dream of a clean life finally made possible." Years passed. The children grew into remarkable young adults, each following the path they'd chosen in childhood. Marcus indeed became a doctor, studying at the University of California before returning to Arizona to serve the frontier communities that had shaped his childhood. Emma became a teacher, and eventually the principal of Copper Ridge's first public school. Samuel followed Cain's example, becoming a territorial marshal dedicated to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Clara continued her work as a frontier nurse, eventually founding the territory's first training program for medical assistants. Cain remained her constant companion and protector, officially adopting the role of the children's stepfather when they asked him to. The crescent birthmarks faded until they were barely visible, but the children never forgot what they represented. Not shame or obligation, but the power of choice. They had been born into a legacy of violence, but had chosen to create a legacy of healing, teaching, and protection. On Clara's 50th birthday, as they gathered for dinner in the house that had become the center of their chosen family, Emma raised her glass in a toast. "To Mama Clara," she said, "who showed us that family isn't about the blood you're born with, but the love you choose to give and receive." "To the woman who followed her heart instead of her heritage," Marcus added. "And to the family that proves every day that we can be better than our beginnings," Samuel concluded, as Clara looked around the table at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. Her children by choice, her partner in all things, the community that had embraced them all. She thought about the terrified woman who had stumbled out of the desert 8 years earlier with no memory and 3 babies to protect. That woman had been searching for her identity, not knowing that The most important identity of all was the one she would choose to create. Clara Sullivan, nurse, mother, protector, teacher, had built a legacy not of fear and violence, but of love and hope. The birthmarks had made the children targets, but they had also led them to a family that valued choice over birthright, love over loyalty, and hope over heritage. As the Arizona sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara knew that they had all chosen well. Their story had begun with 3 babies marked by destiny, but it would continue with 3 adults marked by choice, and that made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.